This is one of the pictures that sometimes is up there when we have communion. I love this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures of Jesus and his disciples. I think that sometimes when we picture Jesus in this upper room with his disciples having this, I don't know, maybe I got this picture from a book when I was a kid, but I see this big room about this size, and there's this big long table, and they're all just spread out, kind of like the Leonardo da Vinci picture, But this kind of gives the idea, it's small, it's intimate, they're close together, they're sharing something very special. And there wasn't a lot of big real estate in Jerusalem, so probably all the rooms were pretty small, and they were cramped in there. They rented a room to be able to celebrate this time here together. And I love this picture because it just shows that they're all there together. They're having this meal together in a very, very special way. We know that Jesus had his 12 disciples. We know that he had, out of the 12 disciples, there were 3 of them that he was closer to than the others, and that was Peter, James, and John. And we know that even amongst those, there was one that he was especially close to. And this is the disciple we're going to take a look at today. This is a disciple that followed him all the way to the cross, a disciple whose name is John. Now, we know that Jesus loved everybody. But Jesus was God, and he was also human. And so as a human, he experienced things that are very true to our human experience. And one of the things that he experienced as a human was that he had a best friend. And we can't fault him for that, for maybe being closer to John than maybe the other disciples. We all have people that we're closer to than other people, and we have these circles of relationships. And Jesus, as a human, the Son of Man, had these as well. Now, this wasn't a friend that he grew up with. Some of us have friends from childhood that we've stayed close to our whole lives. Other times we have new situations in our lives and we meet new people, and they become in those inner circles of our friendships. And in Jesus' adult life, at the age of 30, when he called his disciples, one of them that he met was this guy named John. And for the 3 years that they walked together and worked together, they formed a very close relationship. And John was in that inner circle. We mentioned John last week as being having a brother, James, who was also a disciple of Jesus. And we talked about the fact that John and James were from a fishing family. Their parents were named Zebedee, and the mother's name was Salome. And Salome was one of the women that we talked about last week who was at the cross. So we kind of got this whole family here that's kind of involved in Jesus' life. Zebedee and Salome, and then the sons James and John. And it was Salome who asked Jesus if it was okay that James and John could have a special place in the kingdom of Jesus, to be there together as kind of like the vice presidents of this kingdom. And Jesus told her that it wasn't up to him to be able to give authority in that sort of way, but he invited them all to come and to be a part of his kingdom. So that's kind of the background who we're talking about here. We're talking about John, and I'm sure that Salome, seeing the close relationship that Jesus had with John, probably thought, well, definitely, John's going to have a pretty high post. And I mean, James is his brother, he's up there too, and so definitely they're going to get special favors in God's kingdom. And even though Jesus maybe had a special best friend, he doesn't place people above others in the kingdom of God. That was just on a human level. How do we know that they were best friends? Well, we know this from John himself, because when he wrote his Gospel of John, many times he referred to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And we don't know if he gave himself that nickname or not, or whether that was something that all the others said, well, you're the special one that he loved. We don't know where it came from, but several times he called himself that. And some examples of this is in John 13:23, it says, one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. That was at the Last Supper. At the cross, when Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. At the resurrection, or after the resurrection, John 21:7, then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. And so often John refers to himself, not by name, but he describes the disciple whom Jesus loved. Wouldn't it be cool to be able to call yourself that, to put yourself in that place, that you could be Jesus' best friend? And I think we'll find out today that he does call us his friends, and we'll get to that shortly here. John seemed to understand the nature of Jesus' love. He caught that, and in his book of John, the Gospel, and the 3 epistles that he wrote, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John that we call that. They have very original names for the books here. They just put them in numbered order. But in those books, one of the biggest themes that John writes about is the love of God, the love of Jesus. If you're ever wanting to learn about the love of Jesus and what it means to have it in our lives and how to spread that love with others, then the Gospel of John and the 3 books of John are great places to go to be able to learn about the nature of God's love. And when, in the garden, Jesus was arrested, and all the disciples scattered, they were afraid they were going to be arrested too, being guilty by association. There was one disciple that stayed there. Through the trials, through the crucifixion, that was John. The best friend of Jesus didn't give up on him because he understood the nature of love in a very special way, that love overcomes all fear. The other disciples were so afraid. They loved Jesus, but they were more afraid than they had love. But we see the opposite in the disciple whose name was John. Just before the arrest and crucifixion, the disciple Peter had said, "Jesus, I'm going to follow you all the way." And Jesus said, "No, you won't. You're actually going to even deny that you know me 3 times before the rooster crows the next morning." And Peter's like, "I would never do that. I would never deny you, Jesus." And he was sincere. He didn't plan to do it. But then these circumstances came up and he was so afraid that he did deny Jesus 3 times. John was right there where Jesus was, but Peter was in the background there, kind of hiding in the shadows to see what was going on. He really meant well. But when it came time to push and shove, he denied that he knew Jesus because he was afraid. But John, in contrast, was not afraid. He could have easily been arrested out there in public, following Jesus around to all the different things that was going on during that time. But he stuck with him. John wrote about the love of Jesus in John 15:13, which he said, "Greater love has no one than this, than someone lay down his life for his friends." And here's John, seeing that Jesus is going to give up his life for him, but he's also willing to walk into death himself for Jesus. He had that kind of commitment that mirrored the commitment of Jesus. And that's what we're wanting to see in ourselves. Do we have the commitment to Jesus that he has to us? That he's willing to love us even to death. Would we be willing to love Jesus into death? Some of us would love him to death, but we don't love him for life. We got to love him for life and all the way, even if it took us to our death. So there was a special bond that was going on between John and Jesus. And here at the cross, we find John amongst the number of people who were there. These women followers that we spoke of last week were there, and John was there with them. And you wonder, did John understand what was going on? We don't really know what was going on through John's mind when Jesus was being crucified in front of his very eyes. We do know that after Jesus had risen, and the women went and told the disciples, well, Peter and John, they went running down to the tomb to be able to see what was going on there. And in John 20, verse 8, it says, "The other disciple," which is John, "he reached the tomb first. He went in and he saw," and what? Believed. He believed that Jesus had rose from the dead. It probably was all coming back to him now. Jesus had talked about this, but they didn't really understand it. They didn't see how death and resurrection was going to fit into the picture of the story of their lives. But when John went down to that empty tomb and he saw that the body wasn't there, as the women had told him, he believed. He realized that Jesus had risen from the dead, as he had said. There's a lot of people today, unlike John, they love the cliche, yes, Jesus died for me. Yeah, Jesus died for me. We love a martyr. A martyr story is a wonderful story. It inspires us. It makes us feel like, wow, something very important. Somebody stood on their principles, what they believed in. And out of love and commitment, they went all the way to the grave. We love that story. But for a lot of people, it stops there. Jesus is just their martyr that died for them. But Jesus is more than that. He's the God who conquered death. He went all the way to the grave, which is wonderful, but he didn't have to surrender to death. He didn't have to surrender to the grave. And we have a God, Jesus, who loves us so much that he not only died for us, but he comes back and he continues to love us forever and ever and ever. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. If we miss the power of the resurrection, then Paul told us in 1 Corinthians 15:14, it says, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We don't have faith in a dead person. We don't have faith in a dead Jesus. We have a faith in a Jesus who conquered death and offers us that he can help us to conquer not only physical death when it comes to us, but to conquer spiritual death, because we're all born spiritually dead. And at some point along our lives, we meet Jesus and we see his love and we see him extending his hands of friendship to us. And we have a chance to be reborn in our spirit and come alive again on the inside through the forgiveness, through the grace, through the love and mercy of Jesus Christ as we repent from our sins and trust him as the sacrifice that makes it happen. And we have that hope that we can live for Christ just as he continues to live for us. The commitment goes two ways. As he is loving us, we love him in return. At the cross, John is there with the group of these women that we talked about last week. We know that John's own mother was there. We know that Jesus' mother was there. And we read an interesting little situation that happened while Jesus is on the cross. In John 19, 26 and 27, it says, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. What was going on here? Here's Jesus dying on the cross. And he only said a few things while he was up there. But this is one of the things that Jesus, in the midst of his suffering and being on the cross, it's very difficult to breathe. It's very difficult to talk. But he was able to get these words out. 3 words and 3 words, behold your son, behold your mother. He saw them there and he realized he wanted to make sure that his mother was taken care of. Jesus was the oldest son. We know that he had brothers. We know that his brothers didn't believe in him. They didn't follow Jesus, at least at that time. We know that probably Joseph has died during this time between the birth of Jesus and his adult life, because he's nowhere in the scriptures following this. We know that Jesus, being responsible for his mother as the oldest child, took a moment to be able to say, John, please take care of my mom. Mom, let John take care of you. Jesus wasn't sure if his brothers were going to do that or not. And he wanted to make sure, at least spiritually, that his mother was provided for, that she had a sense of family, that she knew that she belonged. Because here she was losing her son, the Messiah, the one who had come miraculously into her womb. And here he is dying, and she needed some sort of comfort at this time. And Jesus made sure that that was taking place. We do know that later on, at least some of his brothers did come to believe in him. We know that sometime after the resurrection, that Jesus appeared to his brother, whose name was James. And we know that there was a connection that was made there. And James became one of the leaders in the church. And so we know that there was a lot of reconciliation that took place as a result of the cross. Besides taking care of Mary, we know that John became one of the leaders in the church. He was the disciple who lived the longest. And in his old age, when he was exiled to a deserted island because of his faith, the leaders didn't want him around doing his work anymore, so let's just put him on this island. And while he was there, Jesus came to him and gave him a vision of what was going to happen in the future, what the heavenly kingdom would look like. And John got to experience that. And in whatever ways he could, he wrote that down in a book that we call the Book of Revelation, to be able to see the love of God as it's going to be at the end of the age, when we live in a place where there's no more death or dying or pain or crying or sickness or anything sinful that's breaking up this world. And we look forward to that day, as John did as well, to be back with his best friend again. He was the disciple who Jesus loved, and he loved Jesus as well. And we're called today to accept Jesus' love and to love him in return. when we get to the time when we're going to take the communion today, we're going to do something slightly different. Usually while it's being passed out, Judy or whoever's on the organ is playing something quietly. But during that time, when we're reflecting and taking the elements, I'm going to be reading some verses that are from the books that John wrote that talk about the love of God. These are actually in your bulletins. You can go home and look at them, but I will be reading those, and you can listen to it softly as you're praying and preparing your heart for communion today. So as we reflect, let's think about the love of God as we take the elements, the bread and the cup, which remind us of the sacrifice of Jesus and how much he's loved us.